Hello, and a warm welcome to this 12th and final session of Introduction to International Relations. And in this presentation, we're going to be looking at terrorism and globalization, and a focus on how terrorism has evolved over time, and again, its relationship to globalization in the late 20th, early 21st century. And before we start, one key factor that I want to emphasize about terrorism, that there will be a focus on non-state actors, and that's a choice I make here for this presentation, because arguably also state actors historically and contemporarily can be referred to as terrorist actors. And I'll go into more details about the whys later on. But the point is, any actor, whether a state or a non-state actor, that uses violence, the tool of violence, to achieve a certain political objective, this is what defines a terrorist actor. And of course, the definition itself can be contested, but the point is that there is some sort of political aim or objective in place. So it's not just violence for violence sake, it's not just willy-nilly in that sense. Even if the actor in question, whether an extreme right, neo-Nazi, Islamic fundamentalist to a lesser extent, but also the case it could be an extreme left, could be a separatist movement, whatever the case might be, some sub-state or non-state actor, there is some sort of political objective in place. And sometimes this is argued by government as not the case, it's just violence, end of story, but there was always some sort of political objective, abhorrent or otherwise, if one wants to be moralistic about it, but that we need to understand that as a key premise of what terrorism is, if we want to understand the phenomenon, and if we want to understand how to deal with it. And that's what this presentation will look at historically, conceptually, look at terrorism, and look at how public policy actually deals with this challenge that is terrorism. And so, without further ado, I take us now again to the first slide, and an image here that you can see of a terrorist attack taking place in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and you can see the carnage, the aftermath of the terrorist attack, the destruction of buildings, human life in particular, but also property, etc., fear into local people in Afghanistan from a terrorist actor to achieve a particular objective. And again, as I emphasized, there will be a certain focus on the post 9/11 world. There is, of course, debates about the so-called global war on terror, whether the term war on terror is ever useful, whether more right or left-leaning criticisms of the Bush administration and other governments for how they've firstly created 9/11, not the attacks themselves, of course, but actually the response to it and a so-called war on terror, whether that was ever useful or is a useful label and an approach to dealing with the phenomenon of terrorism. But nonetheless, there will be a focus on the post 9/11 world, because that's often, that is the world that we live in on some level. Whether we use the term post-Cold War, post 9/11, for the post 9/11 world, security, this relationship between security and liberty, going to an airport. So before 9/11, less security checks than there are now. This is a response to not only the attacks of 9/11, but how, let's say, institutions were created in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Not only the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also domestically, how it's impacted on our respective societies. And again, like I said before, introducing the slides, terrorism is, so I go into a definition now, a working definition. Terrorism is characterized first and foremost by the use of violence and having a political aim. So the tool is to use violence to achieve a certain political objective. And I've already referred to different groups, sub-state groups, non-state actors that use it to achieve certain objectives. But here we can see that the state can also play a role. So during the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799, there was state violence that subsequently took place, led by Robespierre, after the immediate aftermath of the success of overthrowing the Ancien regime, and all this, let's say, political, ideological components and the French Revolution, the event itself has had a major political impact on many different societies. But nonetheless, as we now know, with Robespierre and other leading figures, it quite quickly descended into major violence, but also major violence against its own citizens who were not following in a pure way, a fundamental way, what the revolution was advocating, which led to great violence. And here we can see that terrorism generally has a revolutionary aspect. Again, when we think of, let's say, a Leninist approach to, and this is Olivier Raz, the French political scientist, or let's say Islamic terrorism, seemingly very, very, very different, and they are very different in a whole host of ways. But nonetheless, this revolutionary factor is what can sometimes connect with terrorism. It doesn't mean, by the way, that every revolution that's taken place necessarily equates to terrorism. Certainly not. And this is not what I'm arguing, but what I am arguing is that it's trying to upend a certain old social and political order, and done in a violent way, and a violent way with certain political aims. And again, after this French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, you have, of course, Napoleonic Wars, and one correction from a previous, on a date, from 1803 to 1815, and you have different states fighting against one another, the Napoleonic Wars. Here, there is a key point that I want to distinguish. You have different, in the case of the Napoleonic Wars, you have different empires. Whether we look at the First or Second World War, state-to-state violence used from different actors, it's not defined as terrorist. Terrorism, again, is here in the case that there is particularly a focus on upending already what's in place, so certain political and social order, and fundamentally trying to radically change this social and political order. And hence this, again, I will put a focus on non-state actors for this presentation. Of course, you have critical theorist thinkers like Noam Chomsky, who would refer to actually terrorist actors also being Western actors, so his critique of US foreign policy as an example. But nonetheless, to keep this quite clear, systematic, we have to think that who are these actors, what are they doing, and actually trying to upend certain social and political order is a legitimate aspect, is a factor. It's only legitimate, of course, if it convinces others, and there is some ethical component to that too. But is there the case, for example, of using violence to achieve a certain political aim? Are there cases where it can be legitimate? Well, and this is where we get into the just war tradition. Now, what you may remember from a previous presentation, International Ethics, the just war tradition, jus ad bellum, jus in bello. And the just cause, is there a right to terrorist action? Is there a legitimate objective that wants to be achieved? A group has been oppressed violently or in other ways, is there therefore a legitimate reason for doing it, for, let's say, unifying a country, whatever the case might be? Then the use of violence has to be proportional. Again, you can see how this connects with a just war tradition. It has to be used proportionally, and again, as a use of force. So whenever we refer, let's say, to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, to use the examples in the post-9/11 world as examples, violence is used firstly indiscriminately, arguably. It's used not as a last resort, but used in a consistent, now I'm going to give an overview, abhorrent way. And therefore, what this leads to is that clearly, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other non-state actors, transnational actors, that they are clearly not doing it in the just war tradition. So can there be legitimacy for certain acts? This is obviously a big debating point, but nonetheless, one would need to follow these examples to have the possibility that it can be seen as legitimate. And again, it's the weakest form of irregular warfare, because these particular groups, they often do not possess the broad support of the population. As the examples I've already given, the only way that they get support is through terrorizing and terrifying the populace so that they get support that way. But it's not some deep-rooted, legitimate way of that we're oppressed and we need to go against our oppressors. No, it can be something that leads to a very nihilistic approach. But again, we have to understand it if we're doing public policy or approaching it. and I'll make certain further points later on in this presentation about that. But again, it inspires fear, and the media and public opinion is important. But if you inspire fear, then supposedly you can get some influence, some control of a situation, but it can also lead to disaffection of public opinion. So Al Qaeda was never a popular movement in the Middle East or elsewhere for a whole host of reasons, but nonetheless, the narrative that was used that we're fighting this great superpower, there was some sympathy in some quarters, again, not only in the Middle East, but in different parts of the world. But quite quickly, and here I cite the Middle East more directly, when Al Qaeda was carrying out terrorist attacks also in the Middle East, quite quickly in a range of countries, it was never popular, but the popularity it had quite quickly dwindled, and it was just seen as a violent group in a number of, let's say, Middle Eastern countries and so on. So whatever the state actor or non-state actor is, an example I give, or transnational actor, it needs to get some sort of legitimacy. And this is where technology and its relationship to globalization is important. Technology has facilitated, let's say, terrorist actors to achieve their aims more easily. But again, here we must, one key point that I want to reference is that a lot of groups like Al Qaeda or ISIS are seen as anti-modernity, that they're seen as wanting to go back to the time of Muhammad, 1,400 years ago, etc. In actual fact, they are a response to modernity, and that's an argument that Olivier Rat, the French scholar, and others have made, that it's a response to modernity. And so it's using the tools of modernity and responding to it, and obviously responding to it in a violent way, and arguably nihilistic way. Now, going now from transnational to global phenomenon, and I'm going to build this up really over the 20th and going into 21st century. So traditionally, terrorism was within borders, usually a sub-state actor against a state actor trying to upend this particular political and social, even economic order. But in the 20th century, and really in the post-Second World War context, you can see the birth of transnational terrorism, where it goes very much beyond borders. And the expansion of commercial air travel is a good example. So whether in Japan, Italy, Germany in the 1960s, 1970s, I've referred to extreme neo-Nazi groups, separatists, and of course Islamic fundamentalists and other groups we could refer to. But here, when we think of, let's say, extreme left groups like the Baader Meinhof in Germany and their relationship with the Palestine Liberation Organization, hijacking planes or supporting the hijacking of planes, killing of Israeli citizens. This was facilitated through commercial air travel, and attacks on planes was something, as we know, in the 1960s, 1970s, became a strategy used by the Palestinian Liberation Organization to get their message out. Likewise, Munich Olympics, 1972, the murder of a number of Israeli athletes and the inept response from the West German police on this particular case. Now, the violence that was used and heavily criticised, the PLO was heavily criticised, referred to as a terrorist actor, but nonetheless, this was arguably a strategic calculation of Yasser Arafat. It got a lot of attention, a lot of publicity. And really, I think a year or two later, you have Yasser Arafat going to the UN General Assembly to make a speech, really promoting the cause of Palestine and Palestinian independence, the overthrow of Israel. Eventually, as we know, jump forward 30 years, and there's much more the case. Sorry, jump forward 20 odd years with almost an agreement with Yasser, with Yitzhak Rabin, excuse me, and a two-state solution in the early mid-90s. But the point is, at the time, Yasser Arafat, PLO, was wanting to liberate Palestine and have a state. And this was an effective way of, according to Arafat and key figures around him, of doing it, carrying out this violent attack against innocent Israeli athletes. And the publicity helped, arguably, the PLO's cause. How much it helped and what way is an open-ended question, but actually it put the focus of public attention, international public opinion, on the Palestinian cause. There are not always the case with political and ideological interests, and it's not, I'm not equating the PLO now with being an extreme left organization. It wasn't. But here there are different groups that may find some sort of interconnection, some sort of overlap in terms of interests. So it's not always the case that there's the exact same political and ideological interest. It can be broader than just saying, okay, we all believe this and this is why we're trying to achieve it. There can be different political and ideological interests, but there's a common cause, a common enemy, whatever the case might be. And again, initially, this is a decision that states need to make: how much they agree to some of the demands, how much they compromise. Whether you have, in the case of Thatcher against the IRA in the 1980s, or whether you think of George W. Bush's administration against Al Qaeda in the post 9/11 context, we don't talk with terrorists, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Well, actually, often there is conversation, dialogue going on, also with the intelligence services and so on. But there is an open-ended question in public policy of what sort of communication takes place and why. And so now, post 9/11 world. And again, this is political. This is a point that we live in a post 9/11 world, at least according to when we look at terrorism, because this belief system is in place, institutions have been created, and Al Qaeda as an actor has been seen as the key actor that's been needed to be defeated. Now, again, the so-called war on terror, fighting war on terror, there's an open-ended question of how useful that label is, how it's been approached, whether there should be more police and intelligence services rather than invading a country and being heavy-handed in the case of whether Afghanistan or Iraq. But here, when we look at Al Qaeda and the base historically in Afghanistan, Pakistan from 1996 to 2001, and post 9/11, Al Qaeda and the leadership subsequently, some like bin Laden going to Pakistan. But nonetheless, Al Qaeda, the base, existed from 1988 onwards. And it's really towards the end of the Soviet-Afghan war where bin Laden had a very, very minimal role living in Peshawar, Pakistan, but the various mujahideen groups, religious nationalist groups fighting the Soviet Union, the Soviet oppressor was the narrative. Bin Laden played a minor role and not very significant role at the time. But anyway, in the end of the Cold War, he moves back, bin Laden moves back to Saudi Arabia, and quite quickly becomes disaffected with the Saudi government. Why? Because the Saudi government allowing the US bases in Saudi Arabia to fight against Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War of 1990, 1991, what have you. And so bin Laden is expelled from Saudi Arabia by the authorities, and he goes to Sudan. In the case of Afghanistan, the Taliban takes over Afghanistan in 1994. And in 1996, bin Laden and key figures of Al Qaeda moved to Afghanistan, and it's a base that they can use to actually orchestrate, plan attacks against various different state actors in the West and elsewhere, to create what's known as a global ummah, a global community of believers in the mindset of what Al Qaeda trying, this purist mindset that Al Qaeda is purporting to promote, is promoting. And here, when we look at it, what is Al Qaeda? Well, there's a leadership, or there was a leadership, at least in the Afghanistan-Pakistan borders, and that they're organizing attacks. Or is it much more decentralized, affiliated groups with cells and groups? It's an open-ended question, and again, terrorist scholars have debated whether it's more centralized or it's very, very much decentralized. But the key point here is there was always the case that there was a loose network of different groups, and whether we think of the 9/11 attacks themselves, whether we think of Hamburg or Michigan or East London, or whatever the case might be, there are different cell groups working together, coordinating loosely certain attacks that might subsequently take place, whether in New York, whether in Washington, whether in Istanbul, whether in London, whether in Indonesia, and here I'm referring to a number, whether in Madrid, I'm referring to a number of attacks in the post 9/11 world. So let's look at some explanations for terrorism and globalization and the relationship between the two. So again, cultural explanations. It's often seen as violence is used as a way of preserving certain traditions and values. And again, I re-emphasize there's a purity here. Not in practice, maybe, but what actually takes place, but this is belief system that there needs to be a purification, that we've been infiltrated by something impure. And in the case of, let's say, the Greater Middle East and other parts of the Islamic world, there was an argument made, and it's not just the Islamic world, well, the US, let's say, with Hollywood films, music, culture, fashion, it's actually this incursion has, let's say, done something very negative to our own societies, this overly materialistic approach. And so it's a way of preserving certain traditions and values. On the other hand, you have political scientists like Samuel Huntington, who say from a more Western-centric point of view, and Huntington as political scientist wrote in a range of different areas, but he's famously known for writing a book, The Clash of Civilizations, where he posits there are 7, possibly 8, and Africa he puts in a question mark. And there's an element of ethnocentrism, arguably, to the work. But the point is that his point is there are distinct civilizations, and in the case of the Western Islam or the Western Confucius, read China, there's going to be potential fault lines and potential conflict that emerges, as we can see in the world at large. And this is something that we're going to have to deal with moving forward. It's going to be a key factor in global politics and security. He's been criticized by post-colonial thinkers like Edward Said and those on the left, but also some on the right. He's been criticized for simplifying the Islamic world, for making it homogeneous, that actually the Islamic world and it's all the same thing. Well, it isn't. It's a very rich, pluralistic part of the world, and also the same with the West, that the West is one thing. And also there's this self-fulfilling prophecy that if you argue that something is likely to happen, then actually it ends up happening because enough people believe in it. And so this, and certainly there are some conservatives too who are critical, but there are this very conservative mindset that we are this way, you are that way, so post-structuralist thought here is important too. Therefore, it's a way of reinforcing why violence takes place in the world. And you have, of course, people like Homi Bhabha, post-colonial thinkers, who say actually it's much more, civilizations themselves are much more a mixture, and there's hybridity, there's an influence going in both directions. Nonetheless, and to cut a long story short, Huntington's thesis is something that's supported by some policymakers and some scholars, and has played a role in why there has been conflict between Western countries and the Islamic world. And this is something that you always need to consider and think of critically. So further economic explanations now. So we referred to cultural, now we're going to go to economic explanations. And it's, yes, that globalization and forms of capitalism, especially in the post-Cold War context, that, let's say, countries and multinational corporations have benefited hugely. There's great inequality, there's great unfairness and justice in this world, and so it's a response. A violent response, maybe a wrong response, but nonetheless it's a response to Western economic imperialism. This is a narrative that's used by Al-Qaeda, but actually this is a narrative that could be used by a whole range of groups. Also, let's say far left groups can use this particular narrative, or do use this narrative. But nonetheless, it tends to be, let's say, radical groups on the right and transnational terrorist groups that are the one that have, generally speaking, in recent times, have used violence as a tool to achieve certain political objectives. And why? Because there's much more insecurity in socioeconomic privatization, deregulation of industries in particular countries, and therefore there's less certainty, less security for peoples, and this is something that terrorist actors are trying to exploit. And they argue, and some argue, that this violence is motivated by this inequality of the global economy. And whether one sees it as a desperate response, as a very negative response, nonetheless, this is an argument put forward, a narrative put forward, that actually it's a way of countering economic dominance that the West has. One caveat to this that I should emphasize is that Al-Qaeda, again, and bin Laden himself, it's not always the case that the terrorist actors come from poor backgrounds. Just want to make this point, that they often come from a middle class, or even sometimes the case of bin Laden, a very wealthy background. So it's not, and this is a counterpoint to what I've just said, and therefore we should not just see through the prism of one fact of what causes terrorism, but nonetheless it's arguably a point to consider, or a point that you could argue for. Now, terrorism and globalization, and again, in the post 9/11 world, religion and new terrorism. So this postmodern idea that, let's say, there are different belief systems, etc. So it's not just trying to get territory from a state, and that were not too dissimilar, but actually, and an idea that actually that we do this for divine reasons. How do you, for example, counter someone that says this is actually you're doing this to go to heaven? Very difficult. But nonetheless, and this is an important narrative used by different jihadist groups in different parts of the Islamic world in particular here, but it can also be, of course, in Europe and the US. But it's often the argument is made that actually, look at the war in Afghanistan, look at the war in Iraq, look at Libya. Why is it that it's always Islamic countries where the West, the US, the UK, and other European countries, not just the UK, have let's say, attacked, invaded, to use this narrative, and oppressed Muslims? You see, this is a narrative, and this is something that has some sort of belief system that is in place amongst certain groups of a society. And again, look at societies in Europe, the US, Australia, spiritually, morally bankrupt, overly materialistic. These are the arguments that jihadists make. So, do we accept Western beliefs and better integrate in various societies, or do we preserve this spiritual purity by rebelling? And this is something that jihadist groups play into, this narrative, this binary narrative that both sides can sometimes emphasize or re-emphasize. So again, we have to think, what is it, and how we deal with, let's say, a particular issue is how do we work some sort of, how is dialogue possible? How do we understand each other? And one thing I would say, which is very important, because I emphasize this aspect of violence and in order to achieve certain political objectives, trying to understand what motivates a terrorist and what motivates a terrorist actor is an important first step. Rather than just saying these are bad people, these are evil people, end of story, because they kill innocent people, etc., etc. By understanding, it doesn't mean you have sympathized necessarily. It doesn't mean you sympathize. It doesn't mean you condone. But it's understanding that's important. And why? But nonetheless, again, as one is a religious fundamentalist, it's very difficult to deter that, for the obvious reason that if you think you're going to heaven, how do you deter that? Now, globalization, technology, and terrorism. So again, states have always had a certain advantage and still do in many ways have an advantage in terms of how they counter terrorist actors, non-state, sub-state actors, transnational actors. Nonetheless, arguably in the last 20 years, the internet and World Wide Web has started to play a role in changing this dynamic. Not completely. It's not a complete sort of everyone now has complete influence, but again, this postmodern idea that everything is much more pluralistic, there's not one truth, etc. Fighters often have been immortalized in the virtual sphere. So again, bin Laden, post 9/11 attacks, by some in some parts of the world, was immortalized, seen as this great heroic figure. Again, the narrative here, a Robin Hood-like figure, etc., etc. The way, let's say, Che Guevara was, or some other figures during the Cold War was referred to. Different, of course, acted different political objectives, but nonetheless, this is where groups and individuals can be immortalized. And this dissemination of propaganda is therefore made far easier. How do you, so there's a lot of, let's say, government institutions, think tanks, counter-radicalization, counter-terrorist organizations that are trying to, let's say, look at propaganda, how it works, how it, let's say, radicalizes certain groups and individuals, and how you can deal with it, how you can have another alternative narrative or another narrative to actually promote something that doesn't lead to violence and violence against innocent people. But the common ubiquitous infrastructure can be used to coordinate attacks and other actions. So you have various things in place to coordinate, and this information sharing and logistical sharing helps facilitate terrorist attacks. And again, this is where you have this nexus and relationship between the three factors of globalization, technology, and terrorism. Again, combating terrorism, an important public policy issue. National law, and this relationship on the one hand between security and public order, on the other hand liberties, and a relationship and a balance that often has to be sought out for within societies, especially for liberal democracies. It's a challenge. And then international conventions, agreements, international law. So in the case of, let's say, Afghanistan, and after the 9/11 attacks, the UN Security Council resolution 1368 and 1386, the US managed to get great sympathy and support from the UN Security Council in terms of, let's say, legitimizing certain actions. So what led to Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. what subsequently took place in Afghanistan and then the war also in Iraq is something that arguably challenges or delegitimizes what the US originally sought to do in terms of combating terrorism. But nonetheless, there has been conventions and agreements amongst the international community. And one other factor is how the global north can help and improve and facilitate and give agency to the global south. Often, and here post-colonial thought becomes important again, often global north just thinks, look, we'll sort it out, we'll give you democracy, we'll give you human rights. And the Iraq war is a case of this. Invade a country, do something, and magically you'll have democracy. I slightly simplify, but the point is that and you don't want democracy, well, it's because you could never do democracy. The global north can play a positive, or as you get from my point, or a negative role in facilitating or encouraging, let's say, the global south, not only, let's say, if it wants to promote democracy or human rights or whatever the case might be. And again, this is an open-ended question, if it does and how it does it. But the point is, it should facilitate some sort of agency, whether in Afghanistan, whether in Iraq, referring to the major wars, but also other countries where the countries in question can actually, through governance, through security and development too, perhaps, can actually deal with its own groups within its own borders. So you don't have countries like the US, the UK, Germany, etc., going into other countries in the narrative saying, look, these are the foreigners, they're trying to occupy our lands, which is a narrative that I heard sometimes when I was doing interviews and research in Afghanistan in January 2010. So you have to think systematically, clearly, in a way that understands people's belief systems, narratives, and how you can deal with it, how you can challenge it, and how you can in a sense, establish other narratives that actually can lessen violence rather than increase it. As you may know, of course, the Obama administration, 2009-2017, they inherited from the George W. Bush administration. They were more skeptical of having combat troops in countries, and eventually with Iraq and then Afghanistan at the end of 2014. Now in Afghanistan, you have special forces and trainers, but Obama basically was skeptical of having large troops, a large amount of ground combat troops in countries, because you can make the situation potentially worse rather than better. And so drones was a way of dealing with terrorism. So drones, whether in Afghanistan, but particularly in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, was used increasingly as a way of taking out terrorist actors. On the other hand, and this is the challenge, if you're killing innocent bystanders, you can also create anger amongst local people, amongst the populace, against these actions. So there's an open-ended question of not only how ethical it was, but also whether actually it was effective in combating terrorism, if of course it's killing innocent people, which it was in a number of cases. So we have to think of let's say, different tools and approaches, and whether they're effective and whether they're ethical and whether they're legitimate. So how we deal with terrorism, philosophically, there's a whole range of debates. But again, the post 9/11 world, there were those also, both on the conservative side, but also on the left-leaning side, that actually were critical of Bush and other US and Western governments, and how they said we're having a war on terror. War is problematic because it implicates how one proceeds. And how does a war finish against a transnational actor? How do you say this is now finished? How can you how do they wave a white flag? It's complicated pragmatically, and it's open-ended. And this has been an issue that, therefore, a critique, of course, also in international law, that the US has allowed it, therefore, to be open-ended in terms of how it approaches the so-called war on terror. And again, there are potentially more effective ways. This is pragmatically speaking. Maybe there are, let's say, police and intelligence, which was more a European response to the war on terror in the aftermath of 9/11 attacks. It's an open-ended question how you can do this and whether you need combat troops in a certain context. But the point was, and this is important, when you want to, let's say, defeat terrorism, you have to locate them. And in some cases, yes, there will be the killing of terrorists. But the point is isolating their support in a particular area, local, state, whatever the case might be. And this is where, let's say, relations, working closely with allies in different parts of the world is important. And how you do that becomes important. And public information campaigns have also played a role in combating terrorism, successfully or otherwise. So we now come to the question for class, and I will read it for you. Of all the factors that motivate terrorists, is any one more important than others? And if so, why? I read a second time. Of all the factors that motivate terrorists, is any one more important than others? And if so, why? And here, I want to make a final point about terrorism is that, again, one needs to be able to understand and get inside, try to step inside the shoes of a terrorist actor, the beliefs, the mindset. If one wants to effectively counter it, combat it, it's no good just saying, oh, it's bad, it's evil, end of story, it kills innocent people, etc., etc. Actually trying to understand the motivation, trying to understand the narratives, even if it's to combat the narratives, is an important step in order to let's say understand how one can actually either negotiate with whatever the case might be, or defeat whatever terms might be appropriate depending on the context and the actor we're talking about. But trying to start understand and step inside the shoes of another actor is important. And by having that understanding, then you can more effectively deal with it. And on that note, I just want to really thank you for your attention over these last, this now 12th and final presentation of Introduction to International Relations. It's been wonderful making these video presentations, lovely working with you. I look forward again to seeing you in class, and I wish you a lovely rest of the day, and thank you for listening. Take care. Goodbye.